Hello and welcome to MASHmouth, a podcast covering every single episode of the hit 1970s sitcom MASH. I'm Ethan.
And I'm Vanessa.
Vanessa, today's episode involves divorce and grandchildren, something neither of us really have. So I figured we can just skip our usual intro pleasantries and go right into the episode. What do you think about that?
I think that that's great because I'm sure that we don't have any divorce or grandchildren stories that we really want to share here.
That we want to share, yes. We probably could share a few, but let's maybe not.
Maybe not. Let's keep the episode light and fun.
Yeah. In this episode, mail call again, Colonel Potter gets great news about a new grandchild. Hawkeye gets a newspaper from home, and Radar gets a home movie, while Frank gets some rather distressing news from his wife. Vanessa, what did you think about this episode?
I really liked this episode. I always like the mail call episodes because you get that little slice of home type of thing that you don't always get from just the regular episodes that have the goings on of the 4077. So I enjoyed this episode. I thought it was really cute.
Yeah, this episode was a delightful slice of life vibe, and you know that I like those ones. So I was having a good time all throughout. I liked all these little stories. Frank, maybe at his worst. We say it all the time, but like, has Frank ever been worse than this? I don't know. We're going to have to really, at the end of this podcast, we're going to have to do like a tier list of the worst thing that Frank has ever done and like rank them.
I would be so down for that. Because Frank in this episode, I think that Frank and Margaret in this episode, I have a lot to say about them. So
Yeah.
I'm ready.
Okay. Well, let's not start with Frank, though. Let's start with some more fun news, such as Colonel Potter getting the news that he's going to be a grandfather. And this kind of sets up an arc throughout the entire episode that I really enjoyed. I really liked Colonel Potter's reaction to finding out he was a grandfather. What did you think about this whole baby pool storyline?
I thought it was really cute because it was almost like a gender reveal before gender reveals were a thing.
Right.
I think that it's always really fun for them to have like a betting pool on certain things that are so mundane or just ordinary average in your everyday life. But for them, it's just something to kind of zhuzh up the time that they have to spend at you know, in the military. So that's always that I like when they bet on things like that. I like the betting pool aspect.
And I like that it was kind of set up by Colonel Potter, so it wasn't like a sketchy, underhanded thing. It was like a more sincere, like, I'm having a grandchild, isn't this fun kind of thing. And I like how the betting was only $1, and that a few people were like a little hesitant to join, like Margaret was, but then they hear that this is like a sanctioned betting pool, so she's like, put me down for so-and-so. I just thought that was really fun. That added a lot of like fun charisma to it.
Yeah, I like, because Radar was the one who originally suggested it to Colonel Potter, and Colonel Potter was like, hell yeah, I'm all for it. And he put in his own bet about like what his grandchild was going to be. So I don't know. It was just really sweet to see. So after that, too, is when we get the setup of Frank's wife as well.
Yes, kind of the opposite end of the spectrum here.
Yeah. So Radar is bringing mail to everybody, and then he brings mail to the swamp and shows BJ and Hawkeye this letter from Frank's wife, and very on the sly is like, oh yeah, his wife wants a divorce.
I loved how they reacted to this as well. That BJ said just so casually that like, oh, Frank will blow his brains out. He's only known Frank for like a month maybe in Showtime, and he's already like, Frank's that kind of guy. He's that messed up that he's going to like go to the extremes for this. But, you know, it's a well-deserved divorce, I think, because the reason why she wants a divorce is that like a guy from the camp goes to Frank's hometown, runs into his wife, and like tells Frank's wife about Frank's infidelity. So it's like all above board. It's not a meaningless Dear John letter. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and you can really see why Mrs. Burns would want to divorce Frank, because right at this moment, too, after Radar reveals it to Hawkeye and BJ that Frank's wife wants a divorce, Frank comes into the camp and starts just screaming at Radar. And you're like,
Yeah.
oh, this makes so much sense. Who would want to deal with this man on a daily basis?
Exactly. The cheating is just a get out of jail free card, I suppose.
So Frank reads the letter and he starts to just freak out. He goes immediately to Radar and is like, I have to call home. I have to call home. I have to call home. And that's basically like the rest of the plot of Frank just trying to get a line to his wife to prevent her from filing for divorce. But I thought that this was really interesting because I don't know for sure, but I think this is the first time we find out that Frank is from Indiana.
Oh, yeah, maybe. I think we've heard a little bit about Frank's home life before. Like, I know he has like a $10,000 house or something, you know? But I wasn't sure if they mentioned that it was from Indiana or not. This might be an episode of first for proper hometown locations. Because we get a couple indications of hometowns in this.
Yeah, I am always confused with the amount of I's in this show. Like, Henry is from Illinois, Radar's from Iowa, Frank's from Indiana, apparently. I can't keep it all straight. So I'm always like, did we know this before? Did we not know this before? I can never tell.
I wonder if that was intentional on the writer's part to make it all kind of I names. I just think that's like, if I was writing the show, that's something I would do. I'd be like, I have to have a central theme to all the hometown locations that aren't mentioned in the novel.
Yeah, and I actually thought it was really funny too that I think this is also the first time that Frank's wife's name is mentioned, like her first name.
Right.
And her name is Louise, and so is Trapper's wife's name. And so I'm very confused. Did they recycle these names? Was it a coincidence? Who knows?
It's all a very small pot that they're pulling from. But one thing that stood out to me in this episode is that I had never considered the possibility of Frank getting a divorce, because I know he leaves the show soon. And I just kind of assumed that he'd go back to his happy home life. But now I'm like, ooh, there's going to be so much strife. He's going to actually have to deal with the consequences of his actions. This is so interesting. I kind of want to know what happens to Frank after he leaves the show. Does he stay married? Or does his wife come to her senses and realizes that this man maybe isn't the man that she should be with for the rest of her life?
And speaking of that, too, it was really funny when Frank was talking to Colonel Potter and was just really desperate to get the line home, because he says that his wife worships the ground that he walks on. And I couldn't get that out of my head because no, it's definitely not true for sure. But then I was thinking about when they found Frank's wedding video in that one episode a couple seasons back. Oh my goodness, that was so funny. And she was not having it with him. So I don't think that she really worships the ground that he walks on. I think that was maybe an exaggeration from Frank Burns.
And in this episode, Radar, being the naive kid that he is, he's like, okay, well, if they get a divorce, he can marry Major Houlihan. And Hawkeye very gently is he's not going to do that. He sees his wife as mommy, is what he says, which is insane. And also, the only reason why Frank is fighting for him to stay married, as we find out at the end of the episode, is that he's worried about his wife's father's inheritance. So it's all Frank being awful.
Yeah, it was really funny because he said that all of his stocks or whatever are in his wife's name. And he said that he wants to be not cut off from his father-in-law's will. It's honestly so terrible. And I think that Louise Burns deserves a lot better.
Absolutely.
Because when Frank finally gets the line to his wife, he threatens to kill himself if his wife goes through with the divorce. And honestly, no one wants that kind of man.
That is, again, maybe the worst thing he's done. It's a joke, but that's so abusive, that's not a good thing to do to your romantic partner. So yeah, I agree. That was bad. That was a bad time.
It was such a slimeball conversation too, because he is laying it on really thick to her, telling her how much he loves her and he can't stand the idea of living without her and this and that and the other thing. And then as soon as he hangs up the phone, he like chuckles to himself.
Yeah.
And like he knows that, or he thinks he knows that he got one over on his wife and that he gets to keep like sleeping with Margaret on the side. But then, of course, Margaret was listening in on the phone conversation with his wife. And that was just beautiful. Her reaction, gorgeous.
She throws a chair at him and it shatters behind him when it misses. That was incredible. I had to play that twice to like make sure I saw what I saw. But like Frank was not kind to Margaret in this conversation, really trying to play down her attractiveness. And he calls her like an army mule. Just insane stuff, like uncalled for. And once again, I am questioning how in the world they are still in this relationship at this point. This is such clear breakup territory.
Well, speaking of that, that's what I was saying at the beginning of this episode about having a lot to say about Frank and Margaret, because to me, this is kind of like the beginning of the end for them. And I don't want to...
We've said that before.
Yeah, I don't want to spoil anything for you, but I do think that this episode was kind of the turning point in their relationship, which you will see, I think, in the rest of this season and spilling into next season as well. But I do think that this was a very pointed episode for these two because they don't really recover from this incident.
Oh, really?
I think, yeah. As I said before, I have watched the show several times. And I typically watch it out of order. But from what I remember of watching it in like a chronological order, this is kind of the point of no return for them.
Really?
And yeah. And so it was really, it'll be really interesting to see how their relationship now progresses after this episode.
That's actually so interesting to me. Because I just kind of assumed that this would be one of those episodes that's never really brought up again, you know, the status quo kind of thing. But I'm actually quite happy that this was the breaking point, because we've talked about how, like, they should not be in a relationship at this point, and they always end up, like, back together at the next episode. So I was kind of discrediting Margaret's, like, emotional intelligence, and even if they are slightly together, I'm glad that the glue is coming apart at the seams.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting for me to kind of reflect on their whole relationship. And obviously it's not over yet. Larry Linville is still very much part of the show. But to see the writers kind of pepper in certain things, like we had talked about in previous episodes of Margaret's personality shifting a little bit, her being kind of more done with Frank's silly behavior and his uptight behavior and whatnot. And then to see this episode be such a breaking point for them. And then I'm excited to kind of just see how the writers handle it, because I always knew that there was this falling out between Frank and Margaret because of, you know, what happens in the show. But I haven't seen it really in chronological order like this. So I don't know. It's really interesting. I think the writers are doing a really good job with Margaret and Frank's relationship and Margaret as a character in general.
That's really fun. I'm glad that you're getting a lot out of this, because as someone seeing this for the first time, I'm like, oh, this is cool. I know you've seen this so often, so it's fun that we're both kind of getting the same enjoyment out of it. And just with this episode and the relationship, I thought it was funny and it was very bold of Frank to buy Margaret like lingerie. I thought that was a little bit of a bridge too far for this supposed secret relationship. But I guess height before the fall. You got to have your peak before you absolutely dive into the dirt.
Yeah, apparently. And like we said, the fallout between Frank and Margaret in this episode, she throws a chair at him. She chucks her lingerie that he bought her out at him and says, okay, well, you wear it. I'm done with you, basically.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where we leave Frank and Margaret for this episode, actually, because the scene right after this, after Frank kind of resolves his issues with his wife, but then renews some issues with Margaret, we get this really sweet scene of a home movie from Radar's family. And this was by far my favorite part of the episode. And I think probably that comes as a surprise to no one, but I loved this. What did you think about it?
This was a great part. I love whenever they show home movies. Like you mentioned Frank's wedding video. that was my favorite part of whatever episode that was in. I love seeing everybody's like home lives, and this one was so funny because it has Radar's whole entire family, and Gary Berghoff plays Radar's mom, and I was so... Like, I was like, I don't want to be mean to this woman, but she looks so much like Gary Berghoff. And I had to go to the MASH, like, IMDb page to verify that it was Gary Berghoff doing like Mrs. Doubtfire makeup.
Wait, so you really didn't realize it at the very beginning that Gary Berghoff was playing the character of his mother in this home movie?
I mean, I did, but it's also black and white, like low resolution. So it's like, there's a chance that this is a real woman. And I don't want to be like mean to her by saying like, wow, they really did a good job getting someone who looks exactly like Gary Berghoff.
Oh my God, Ethan, that's really funny. On top of that just makes it better because, like I said, I loved this scene so much. I thought it was so cute and wholesome, their little family dinner, and the way that Radar was narrating what his mom was saying, like when they had a close-up on her and she said, "I love you, Walter," and then she was saying grace at their family dinner. He knew what she was going to say and like how she said it and whatnot. And I think that just says a lot about Radar too, because he is so close with his family, and it's very obvious from this that he knows exactly what his mom is going to say. He knows what his uncles are doing, what they're going to do when they go inside. I don't know.
Yeah.
The fact that he is so tight-knit with his family is very sweet and wholesome.
I loved that all of his family were like little goofballs. Like his uncle or whatever, like would, with his glasses, like bring it corn on the cob up to his eyes and be like, "Look at me, I got corn for eyes." And Radar was like, "I told you about this. It's the funniest thing ever." And everybody was like dying, and it was a delightful, like very wholesome moment for this episode, especially to balance out the more kind of awful nature of like Frank's weird divorce plotline. This just brings the episode to a nice, like, even middle of wholesome and like degeneracy of Frank Burns.
Yeah, it was just really sweet, and I liked how everybody kind of got emotional about it, because I'm pretty sure in the episode where Henry's wife sends him a home video of their family and their neighbors and friends and whatnot, everybody also gets really emotional. So I don't know, I thought it was really sweet that everybody was having a good time and then also kind of, again, getting pretty emotional about it.
Yeah. I love how they were like feeling it, because I'm sure, you know, they know that Radar's like a 19 and he's away from home for so long that, yeah, this is a big deal for him to like see his family again. And it was just really fun. I thought it was a great scene that like added a lot to the episode. This is another episode where I'm like, yeah, I could probably show this to people who like want to be introduced to MASH.
I definitely agree with you. I think that it's just so sweet. And then right after this, we get even more wholesomeness and sweetness with Colonel Potter finding out that his grandchild was born. And he thinks that it's a boy, but turns out she's a girl.
And I loved his whole reaction to this, where he's like, "My grandson's a girl." And then, like, there's a moment where the person on the other line, like, assumes that he's disappointed. And he's like, "Oh, no, I'm not disappointed. This is great news." And, you know, that's just such grandpa energy, especially, like, 1950s. Like, I'm sure he wanted a grandson, but, like, he's gonna love whoever he gets. And even the end of the episode, like, the very end, before the end credits, is, like, everybody in camp kind of, like, celebrating and, like, drinking champagne, toasting to the new baby. And I thought that was really cool because it wasn't, like, a joke. It was just another little wholesome thing to add on to this episode.
Yeah, it was just in general really sweet. And I thought that this was pretty interesting too, because this is framed as if it's Colonel Potter's first grandchild. But later on in the series, we find out that Colonel Potter is a grandfather several times over. So I think that this was maybe like retconned a little bit. But it was still very sweet, very wholesome.
Okay, well, speaking of retcons, actually, this episode, we get full confirmation that Hawkeye is from Crabapple Cove because he reads from the Crabapple Cove newspaper the entire time. And that just made me, you know, pump my fist in the air because I was waiting for this moment to happen.
It's so interesting to me that they just fully went back and were like, yep, Crabapple Cove, Maine, that's it. But I'm still wondering if maybe Hawkeye is from Vermont and he moved to Crabapple Cove, Maine. That's what I think, personally.
We gotta square that circle in our heads.
Maybe. Who knows? Who knows?
And I liked all the newspaper reading because it was kind of annoying. Like, Margaret calls him out for, like, annoying the rest of the camp. But, you know, I generally don't agree with Margaret. But there was a point earlier in the episode where he was, like, reading to recovering patients in the, recovery ward, this newspaper. And I was like, I've been in the hospital before. If some guy was reading stories of his hometown to me, I would be like, sir, please let me sleep. I do not want to hear about the various shenanigans going on in a place that I do not know.
What's so funny is that the newspaper very much seemed like a gossip magazine. It was just like detailing all of these people who were seen out together and who were dating and this, that, and the other thing. And I was like, who's writing this?
No, you're right. It was very funny, very specific to small hometown life. I imagine if we went digging, you could find this kind of paper everywhere. Probably,
yeah. One scene that I really liked too was when Klinger came into Colonel Potter's office and said that his brothers had so tragically passed away in a harmonica factory explosion, and he was all dressed in black like a mourning widow from old times. And Colonel Potter pulls out his file and says, well, you don't have brothers.
This whole bit with Colonel Potter is so funny. This is like the hardest I've laughed at a Colonel Potter-centric segment so far. That, like, Klinger comes in and he's like, oh, it's unspeakable. Colonel Potter just tells him to shove off if he doesn't want to talk to him. Just absolutely no guff, no nonsense from this man.
This really reminded me of the mother dead, sister pregnant jokes that Klinger tried to pull with Henry. And Colonel Potter, at the same time, just pulls out a file and is like, you said that you don't have brothers. And he's like, no, I was lying. I definitely have brothers. And then as soon as Colonel Potter says, no, you're lying, Klinger just immediately folds. Is like, how did you know I was lying? So it was just a great bit. And I think that anytime that Klinger tries to bring up his family, anytime that Klinger brings up his family in general, it's just so funny.
Just the whole bit with like, well, I was lying because they're illegal and they live under the porch and we had to feed them by gaslight or whatever. Insane.
And him saying that his mother wrote him the letter that his brother supposedly died in Lebanese, but then he burned the letter, and just Klinger and his shenanigans. Just always so good. Always a delight.
I want to know, with the mother pregnant, sister dead thing, or, you know, whatever order that goes in. I want to know if Klinger tried that gambit with Colonel Potter, knowing that he was like a fresh face to scam, but clearly he wasn't having any of it. I hope we get a few more Klinger scams in the future, because these are maybe my favorite bit in the entire show.
You have to commend him for being creative, because that's pretty creative.
Yes, harmonica factory explosion. He could have just said they got hit by a bus.
One other scene that I wanted to talk about was really quick, and in the beginning was when Radar was laughing at Father Mulcahy's first name.
Yeah.
I think this is also the first time that we get Father Mulcahy's like given name too, which again is retconned later on because he is John Francis Mulcahy.
Oh, really?
Yep.
I didn't know that. That's cool.
Yeah. So I think that this season is just very interesting with like putting the characters like more on solid ground almost, because like you said, we established before, I think this is the first season where Radar's given name is said to be Walter. This is when Father Mulcahy gets a real name. This is when Frank Burns is established to be in Indiana. So I don't know. This episode was very interesting with character background development, I thought.
And even the last episode, or maybe the episode before, we do have establishment that Frank has children. So they're doing a lot to just add more to the background lives. You're right. And also, I think this was the first time that it's established that Father Mulcahy's sister plays basketball.
Yes. I remember we had talked about this prior in the episode Dear Sis, and I don't think that they mentioned her being a basketball playing nun, but this is the episode that I was talking about. I was not crazy, I promise.
That's so fun. Again, great concept. I would watch that movie every day of my life. The basketball playing nun. Amazing. I want to know her story. I
would love a spinoff of just Father Mulcahy and his sister just hanging out.
Yes, that's the after MASH we needed but didn't get. While we're talking about bonus kind of scenes that we didn't discuss, one gag that I want to mention is that BJ gets like 50 letters from his wife and the family dog. I thought that was really great and quite adorable.
I thought it was so sweet, not only the dog part, but also the fact that BJ's wife writes him as much as she does, because I was thinking about this and I was thinking about how hard it must be for her having a new baby at home and then having her husband go off to war. Oh, it must be so terrible. And it just also indicates how much they love each other, which just always warms my heart. So clearly they miss each other very much in this little scene.
And as we talked about in another episode, BJ is supposed to be like very young, like he's supposed to be like 28. So you figure his wife is around that same age or younger, 25, 28, having to deal with like your young husband gone. Absolutely one of the worst things that could happen, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean, like, they're barely out of the honeymoon phase, and he is just gone for several months, and it's just... So this scene with the letters just really touched me because it was just so sweet.
And the writing of the letter from the dog, I thought was, like, a very cute 1950s, like, wife thing to do. Because you're like, oh, well, he's a member of the family, too. We got to hear from him.
Yeah, I like that Peg might have been doing that just to, like, make him smile. That, again, makes me so happy.
It was a good time.
Okay, so that was basically the entire episode, very much out of order, but it was, in fact, the whole episode. So, Ethan, do you have any favorite lines from this episode?
One that stuck out to me immediately was during the Radar's Home Movies segment, when he, like, relays the message from his mom saying, like, oh, I love you, Walter. And then everyone else in camp is like, who's Walter? And Radar's like, oh, that's my given name. And so quick, without any hesitation, Hawkeye just says, give it back. So funny.
Without any reaction from Radar. It was really good. My favorite line from this episode was when Frank was very nervous about being able to get a line home, and he was yelling at Radar, and he called Colonel Potter a dimwit or something like that.
Oh, right.
And Colonel Potter was in the room and Frank didn't realize it. So Colonel Potter says, I'd watch that dimwit talk, Burns. Your bulb's been out since I met you. And is he wrong? No.
Again, I love that they've only known Frank for so short of time, but they already have his number just completely. Him and that Colonel Potter and BJ just absolutely know who Frank Burns is to his core. I also have to shout out this other line from Frank where he says, I have so much pressure on me. My mother and father never got divorced. I would have been so much better if I came from a broken home. Insane. What a crazy privileged thing for a man in his, like, early 40s, late 30s to say.
Frank Burns is just an enigma, I think.
He's a real piece of work.
That he is.
So, Vanessa, do you have any trivia for us in this episode?
Surprisingly, I do. So, there wasn't a guest star in this episode, but Radar makes a very offhand comment about not being able to get a line out to either the hospital where Colonel Potter's grandchild is being born and can't get a line out to Frank's wife because of a parade celebrating the re-election of Sygnman Rhee. who I had no idea who that was, but they referred to him as a dictator, and I said, that's interesting. So what did I do? I looked up Syngman Rhee. So
I'm very
here we go.
this.
Syngman Rhee was the president of South Korea from 1948 to 1960. Interesting that they call him the president and also a dictator in this show, but we will get to it.
Okay.
So, in 1952, Rhee was up for re-election, and his political opponents, who made up a majority of the National Assembly, which I assume is more like the Parliament or Congress, were coming at him really hard. So, there were numerous corruption allegations and scandals that Rhee's political opponents used to attack him. Some of the scandals included a son-in-law of Rhee's defense minister embezzling funds that were supposed to go to food, clothing, and equipment for Korean civilians. Another cover-up was the Kochang massacre, in which over 200 men from a Kochang village were rounded up and shot due to accusations of harboring guerrillas within the village. A high-ranking colonel in the South Korean army prevented all attempts at investigating the massacre, and that colonel was later promoted by Rhee to be South Korea's director of national police. So knowing he was going to face a tough re-election, Rhee imposed martial law in South Korea in order to stay in power. When the National Assembly voted to lift the martial law order, Rhee ordered all the members who opposed it to be arrested and pressured remaining members who hadn't gone into hiding to pass a constitutional amendment that would allow Rhee to easily win re-election and remain in power. And he did so until 1960.
What a wild thing just to put into the background of this episode. This is so politically complicated. And, like, if you're unfamiliar with the time period, you would have no idea. This is a joke just for history nerds, for people, like, willing to look it up or already know. That's so interesting.
Well, I was thinking about it, and the show becomes a bit less critical of the U.S. and the military bureaucracy and whatnot as it progresses. But these little quips never really go away. And I think that the writers really intentionally put this joke in the show to say that Rhee was a dictator because he was technically the president and democratically elected. But that being said, he was using that power to, like, be a dictator and to remain in power. So I thought that was a very pointed way of like a little bit of criticism in this episode that was otherwise very, like, light and fun for, like, the history and where the U.S. was and, like, who they were backing in terms of, like, foreign wars at the time. So I don't know. The whole thing was just very interesting to me to look up.
Oh, absolutely. That's one thing that I really do appreciate in the show. The little background mentions that actually give it a place in the real world. That this is not all just goofy comedy, that, like, they've done their research and kind of know what was going on at the time, I think is really interesting. And I'm very glad that you brought this up, because I was worried that there would be no trivia. I was like, there's no one in this episode other than Gary Berghoff playing his own mother. So this is way more interesting than I ever expected. Thank you for this trivia.
Yeah, of course. And I didn't know who Syngman Rhee was, so it was very interesting for me to look him up. So, Ethan, what was your martini rating for this episode?
Another difficult one, because I just really enjoyed this one. And I don't want to just give everything a super high rating, because I feel like that makes me sound like I'm not, like, critically thinking about these episodes. But honestly, for my enjoyment, this might be another 4.5. I had a good time. I had no problems once again.
Yeah, I think that I originally gave this one a 3, but I definitely think that it's in the 4 territory for me. I would definitely give this a 4 out of 5 because everything about it was just so enjoyable. Even though this was more of a straight sitcom episode like the last episode was, it was still really enjoyable. And I did, I think, like it a little bit more. So definitely a 4 for me.
And this is a major turning point episode, apparently, because this is where the ice breaks in Frank and Margaret's relationship, so we can't discount this one as, like, filler, you know? This is an important one to the lore.
This is character building at its finest.
Yes. So, just to wrap up, we'd like to give thanks to you, Jacob, for your back cover, for being our technical consultant, Melissa, Vanessa's sister, for our awesome cover art, and, of course, our listeners. Links to our music, social media, and contact with the show are in the description, as always. And join us next week for Season 4, Episode 16, The Price of Tomato Juice. But until then, if you're going to make a slimy phone call, make sure no one's listening in. Goodbye, farewell, and amen.
Bye, everyone.